everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture where we are, of course, looking at ethics, but we are looking at a couple terms here with ethics kind of setting the scene where we have non-existent, individual, cultural, and then universal. So to start off, we have this term called moral nihilism. And moral nihilism simply declares that nothing is truly moral or ethical. An individual who has at times been portrayed as being a moral nihilist, although there is certainly some debate on that, would be Friedrich Nietzsche. And I would say this would relate to Nietzsche's teaching about becoming the Superman. But what Nietzsche essentially taught is that you have the society, you could say culture, that has a particular type of ethics. And if you slay those ethics and basically laugh in the face of the authority figures, that you have become the Superman and you can create your own form of ethics. But in terms of what is truly moral or ethical, well, nothing. There's not really anything set. Another term is what is called individual relativity. And individual relativity is simply what one individual finds to be ethical, another individual does not. So, who I think of with individual relativity, I think of Soren Kierkegaard, who is considered the father of existentialism. And Kierkegaard had these 3 life stages. Everyone would reach 2 of them, but not everyone would get to the 3rd. But one of the 2 that he held that we would all reach is the ethical stage. And in the ethical stage, we essentially form an ethical or moral code, which is within us. So, essentially what you might find to be ethical or moral, I don't necessarily find to be ethical or moral, and what I find to be ethical or moral, you don't necessarily find to be ethical or moral. Another term, cultural relativity. Well, cultural relativity holds that what is ethical or moral for one culture may not be ethical or moral for another. Essentially, what I had you guys write over relates to the topic of cultural relativity. To give a similar example that my Introduction to Philosophy class gets, this example has its origins with a class that I took as an undergrad called Islam in Transition. The professor who taught the class, he was from Egypt originally and a Muslim. And somehow the topic of Islamic fundamentalism came up. Well, the professor decided to kind of give a scenario of, a culture that has what many would call, an Islamic type of fundamentalism, within the Sharia law, you could say, the Islamic law. And essentially, he kind of created, this scenario. And again, it relates to a culture. But the statements that, he made, which he himself did not personally agree with, but in any case, in our culture, we want women to be covered up to the wrists. We don't want them to be looked upon as objects of sex. In our culture, we want a minute to call people to pray at noon, and we want people to stop what they're doing and pray. In our culture, we don't want any alcohol. In our culture, we don't want any pork. Now, if you don't like the way that we do things in our culture, well then guess what? There's the door to the next culture. You're free to go. But don't tell us how to live our lives in our culture, and we won't tell you how to live your lives in your culture. I think of a number of different scenarios with this particular topic. I had a student one time who had spent some time in predominantly Muslim countries, one being Afghanistan, the other being United Arab Emirates. And I remember how he answered the question relating to cultural relativity in the Muslim world. He began his answer with the statement, "Now, for those Americans that think the Muslim world is quote-unquote messed up, they need to realize something. The United States of America is only 240 years old. While that may be a long time to, some standards, maybe just the average lifespan, obviously, that's nothing compared to cultures that are thousands of years old." And to kind of add to that as well, one of my colleagues that teaches political science, he was telling me in one of his classes when they had to go over foreign affairs, he would tell his students, "Now, you might think that the United States is the greatest country on the face of the earth and everybody should be like us. But you need to realize something. There are cultures out there that are thousands of years old with different customs and different ideas. And while this may shock you to believe, there are some people around the world who do not in any way, shape, or form want to be an American." And he said that after he made that statement, a student in the back started applauding. And he talked with the student after class, and the student was a veteran of the Afghan War. And, he asked him, "What do you think we should do?" And the student responded, "Get out. They don't want us there." And, I asked my one student that had spent some time in Afghanistan what he thought of that statement. He said, "Well, there are a lot of people, merchants that certainly like us, but a lot of those Afghan tribal lords, no, they do not want us there." But, the point being is that ethics will vary, from culture to culture. That, the statement, "When in Rome, act as the Romans do." That, what is okay in the United States is not necessarily okay in China, and what is okay in China is not necessarily okay in the United States. But if one thing is common here with these three terms, moral nihilism, individual relativity, and cultural relativity, is that there is not a universal right and wrong. That, with moral nihilism, nothing is truly moral or ethical. Individual relativity, what you find to be ethical, I don't necessarily find to be ethical, and vice versa. And with cultural relativity, what one culture, say the United States, finds to be ethical, another culture, say China, does not find to be ethical. So, let's stop there. And when we come back, we will look more at some ethical terms, in this case a little bit with universal ethics, and then we'll get into someone that argues in favor of cultural relativity. So take care, I will symbolically see you then.